as America's first overseas missionary, but honestly, he was a brilliant academic, a hardcore skeptic, and probably the last person on Earth you'd expect to take on that role. So, what on earth happened? How did this guy become one of history's most tenacious missionaries? Well, let's get into it.
And that's really the core question here, isn't it? We're talking about a journey that starts with big ambitions and even bigger doubts, takes a turn you will not see coming, and ends with a legacy that no one, and I mean least of all Judson himself, could have ever predicted. So to really understand the man he became, we've got to go right back to the beginning, back when he was a sharp, ambitious young man who was completely convinced that Christianity was something to be left in the past. You've got these two completely different worlds colliding in this one guy. On one hand, he grew up right in the heart of the church. His dad was a pretty stern minister. But Judson was brilliant, like graduated top of his class brilliant. And at college, his whole worldview got flipped upside down by this witty, super persuasive friend named Jacob Eames. Eames introduced him to deism, the idea of a creator who just kind of winds up the universe and lets it go. Judson was sold. He went home, told his totally shocked parents he didn't believe anymore, and took off to make his own way in the world. So, with his faith in the rearview mirror, Judson heads to New York City. The dream? Become a famous playwright. But yeah, that's not what happened. His plans totally fizzled out, and he ends up broke and disillusioned, staying in some small inn in the middle of nowhere. And that night, he can't sleep. Why? Because in the room right next to his, a man is dying, loudly, painfully. And the sounds forced Judson to face the one question his whole new philosophy had no good answer for. What happens when it's all over? The next morning, Judson is just completely shaken up, but relieved the night is finally over. He asks the innkeeper about the guy in the next room, and the innkeeper's reply? It just changes everything. The man who had died in agony all night? It was Jacob Eames. The very same friend who had so confidently convinced him there was nothing to fear in death. In that one instant, Judson's entire worldview just shattered. Okay, so this shocking event just sends Judson spinning in a completely new direction. He actually enrolls in a theological seminary, not because he's a believer yet, but because he is desperate for answers. And it's there that he finds not just a new faith, but a new and what seemed like a totally impossible destination. While he's studying, Judson comes across this book by a British Army officer about a trip to the kingdom of Ava, which today we know as Burma. And for some reason, this book just lights a fire in him. Even though he knows next to nothing about the place, he becomes completely and utterly convinced that this is where he has to go.
There was one tiny problem. America didn't have any organizations to send missionaries overseas. So what does Judson do? In 1810, he helps start one. But just getting to the mission field was, well, insane. On his way to London to get funding, his ship is captured by the French, and he's literally thrown in prison. After he gets out, he finally sets sail for India in 1812 with his new wife Nancy. But then the super-powerful East India Company, which did not want them there, forces them to flee. And their only way out? A single ship, a ship that just so happened to be heading straight for Rangoon, Burma, his original, improbable destination.
You'd think after all that, things would get easier, right? Nope. Arriving in Burma wasn't the end of his trials. It was really just the beginning of years and years of hardship, where it looked like his entire mission was a complete and utter failure. Life in Burma was just brutal. He and Nancy were constantly sick with tropical diseases. They had to deal with corrupt officials who were always demanding bribes. They suffered an unimaginable personal tragedy when their second child died. And on top of all that, Judson was trying to master the ridiculously complex Burmese language, which was a monumental task all on its own. For 6 years. 6 long years he worked, preaching, translating, living among the people, without a single person converting. Just think about that for a second. 6 years of what must have felt like absolute soul-crushing failure. But Judson didn't quit. He got creative. He adapted. He built something called a zayat, which is basically a public shelter, kind of like what local Buddhists used to gather and discuss religion and philosophy. So instead of making them come to a strange-looking church, he met them on their own turf, in a space that felt familiar and non-threatening. And you know what? It actually worked. It was in that zayat that he finally welcomed his very first convert. So just as things are finally starting to show the tiniest glimmer of hope, Judson's entire world is about to be violently ripped apart by forces way, way outside of his control. So in 1824, war breaks out between the Burmese Empire and the British.
And because Judson is a white guy who speaks English, he's immediately pegged as a British spy. He's arrested and violently thrown into prison.
And his imprisonment was an absolute nightmare. We're talking nearly 2 years in a filthy, notorious death prison, suffering from starvation, disease, the whole 9 yards. He almost certainly would have died if it weren't for his incredible wife, Nancy. She was heroic. She lobbied officials, she bribed guards, she smuggled food to him, all while she was taking care of their newborn baby. And his release? It wasn't an act of mercy. It was because the Burmese were losing the war, and they were desperate for a translator to help negotiate peace.
After surviving all of that, the war, the prison, Judson finally had the peace and quiet to focus on what he thought would be his great life's work. But his real, true legacy? It would come from a place he never, ever expected.
Judson spent the rest of his life on one colossal project, translating the entire Bible from the original Greek and Hebrew into the Burmese language. I mean, this was a monumental effort, and it's rightly seen as his crowning achievement, a gift of both literature and faith to an entire people.
A massive translation, decades of work. Sounds like a pretty fitting legacy, right? But here's the thing. The most surprising part of Adoniram Judson's story was still to come, and it had almost nothing to do with his own efforts.
See, during his ministry, Judson had converted a man named Kota Bayu. Now, Kota Bayu belonged to the Karen people, an ethnic minority in Burma. And the Karen had this ancient legend about a creator god and a sacred book of truth that their ancestors had lost long ago. So when Kota Bayu heard the Christian message, he didn't see it as some foreign religion. He saw it as the fulfillment of his own people's story, the return of their lost book. And the result was just explosive. While Judson had struggled for decades to win just a handful of converts, Kota Bayu, who became known as the Karen Apostle, ignited a massive movement among his own people. The difference is just staggering. Within 25 years, you had nearly 12,000 Karen who became believers. In the end, Judson's greatest impact wasn't what he did, but who he inspired.
So when you look at it, Adoniram Judson's whole story comes full circle. His entire unbelievable journey kicked off because he read a book about the Kingdom of Burma. He went through unimaginable suffering to get there and to stay there. And while his own scorecard of converts was small, his greatest legacy was giving the current people the one thing they believed they had been waiting for centuries to find, a book they felt was their own. A story that starts with a skeptic in a lonely inn and ends with an entire nation finding its own lost story.